Essentially, many of these products ship with a root of trust and a set of trusted CAs, and there's not a good way for you to manage that as the administrator of one of these proxies. And then finally, assuming this certificate is valid, it has integrity, it's valid at this point in time, it chains to a root of trust that you trust. Finally, you need to go check, has this certificate actually been revoked? That is, these certificate authorities publish certificate revocation lists that are lists of certificates that are no longer valid for a variety of reasons. In some cases, the end user that purchased that certificate has lost the private key, and they can revoke it. In other cases, there could have been a compromise or a breach that led to the loss of that private key. And at that point, that certificate's fingerprint is going to be published in one of these revocation lists. There's also an online certificate status protocol, or OCSP, where the browser, the endpoint, can actually phone home to a service and in real time check the validity of that certificate. In practice, there's some issues with this protocol due to the fact that an attacker who's performing a man-in-the-middle could block these responses or issue responses saying the service is not temporarily unavailable. That particular response type doesn't require a signature. If you're interested more in some of the flaws around OCSP, you ought to go look up Moxie Marlinspike's talk from Black Hat 2009. He really tore it apart and showed that at a design level, the OCSP protocol has some serious issues, and that in practice, it doesn't really work that well in the case of a true man-in-the-middle attacker. So why are we using encryption? Why are we using SSL and TLS? As I talked about before, you want your communications between the two endpoints to be private, so that an eavesdropper cannot observe them. You want to make sure that no eavesdropper can modify those communications or change them in another way. And you also want to ensure through the authentication that the endpoint you're talking to is who you really think it is. Likewise, we're seeing attackers and malicious users adopting encryption, including TLS and SSL, for the very same reasons. If I'm running a botnet command and control system, or I'm running a botnet, there's advantages if I want to use SSL and TLS as well. I could cloak my communications from eavesdroppers. Many security controls they're not inspecting SSL, so if they're doing signature-based analysis or content analysis, they're not going to be able to observe my communications. And this is part of the reason these SSL interception proxies, these products, are getting deployed. Also driving it is compliance. So DLP, data loss prevention requirements are driving companies to adopt SSL interception proxies. The ones we looked at were typically what you call secure web gateways or web content filtering devices. Examples of these products would be Cisco IronPort web application security, Blue Coat proxies, WebSense proxies. These are the kind of products that have functionality that will terminate an SSL connection, inspect the data, and then connect back to the outbound server with its own SSL connection. So broadly, we're calling all these different technologies that perform this functionality SSL interception proxies. So we first started looking at this technology, and we got interested in it when our organization deployed an SSL interception proxy for DLP and compliance reasons. And as a security research team, we're now having to traverse this new security control, and so we start hacking on it, and we start trying to break this thing. And that was sort of the genesis of this research project of, hey, wow, we just deployed one of these guys on our network, and look at all the issues we're finding on the first day that it was deployed. So what do they really function as? Essentially, these are corporate installed man-in-the-middle devices. You probably won't see the product vendor describe it as a man-in-the-middle because there's some negative connotations to that word. But that's exactly what they are. They're terminating the SSL connection, inspecting the traffic in the clear, and then connecting back out to the eventual endpoint using SSL. So in the case these are deployed, there's not an end-to-end encrypted session. The endpoint is merely negotiating SSL with the proxy, and the proxy is negotiating SSL with the eventual server. In a sense, these are disrupting the authenticity and the end-to-end integrity of that connection in the interest of DLP or the interest of being able to inspect data leaving the enterprise. So I'm not saying that these are good or bad solutions, but part of our research has showed that you need to understand the implications of performing SSL interception, because when the end-to-end principle is broken down, there's a whole lot of transitive trust issues that start occurring between the proxy and the endpoint itself. That end-to-end session is no longer between the two servers, and there's all sorts of flaws that we'll see in the next slide. This is what it looks like when you have one of these proxies deployed. As I showed before, there was a handshake between the client and the server. Eventually they agreed on a cipher suite, they exchanged keys and negotiated a secure session. If you're being man-in-the-middle by one of these devices, you're negotiating with the proxy, and the proxy is negotiating with the server. There's two separate tunnels. In the clear text, there's application data encrypted being exchanged in these two sessions, but the plain text of that communication is actually what's being inspected by that security control. It could be offloaded to other security controls, or the proxy itself may be applying reputation, content matching, or other technologies there. So how do you actually make this work in practice? Obviously, if these certificates that you're seeing from the proxy are just self-signed, your browser is going to generate warnings, your users are going to be calling the help desk. So in most cases, the organization will generate a private certificate authority, and then they'll install that signing key from that certificate authority on these web proxies, or oftentimes issue intermediate CAs hanging off their internal root CA. And then that signing key is used dynamically by the proxy to issue certificates for whatever website that user is browsing to. This can be a logistical problem in some sense, because you need to go distribute that root of trust to all your endpoints. And basically any browser, any endpoint that's going to be sitting behind that proxy, you need to ensure that they trust that root CA, or they trust the intermediate CA that's going to be used to issue certificates. Windows Group Policy can do this pretty easily, but there's challenges particularly with mobile devices that may be on a Wi-Fi network within your corporate enterprise, or other devices that aren't managed by Windows domain policy. So it can be logistically challenging. Another approach that I don't think is particularly wise is to go to a public certificate authority and purchase an intermediate CA to use to issue certs. This is essentially delegating the public root authority to issue certs. So there was a bit of a controversy recently where TrustWave, which also operates a public certificate authority, changed their certificate policies to say that they would no longer issue intermediate CAs to third-party organizations. They had issued one of these certificates, they revoked it, and promised never to do it again. There's some indication that a number of other certificate authorities have done this in practice. In fact, GeoTrust had advertised this as a product called GeoRoot, where they had been advertising on their website that, hey, do you want to issue certificates for anything in the world and not bother with going back to us, the certificate authority, but we'll sell you an intermediate CA for a lot of money. The certificate authorities sort of waved away the risks here by saying that, well, there's contractual language that would prevent the organization from misusing this signing authority. So that in the contract they signed when they purchased this sub-CA, they promised never to, like, man-in-the-middle Google on behalf of a government or something like that. Being a technological person, a geek, I put a lot more faith in technical controls than someone signing a contract and promising never to do something. And so the Mozilla Foundation sent a communication to all of the CAs they trust saying that you need to come clean and admit if you've ever issued a sub-CA for the purposes of man-in-the-middle, and if you have, we'll give you a grace period. But if we later find out that you've done this and you didn't admit to it, we're going to essentially give you the CA kiss of death and remove you from the roots of trust in Mozilla. The responses from the CAs came in, and in several cases, at least 2 or 3 CAs indicated that yes, they had indeed sold a sub-CA, but they were, and the actual phrase was, there were technical/contractual limitations to the use of that certificate authority. They weren't clear which it was. Were there technical controls to put limits on what certs they could sign, or was it merely the fact that they had a contract and maybe a web trust audit every couple years to ensure they're not misusing it? So what are the unintended consequences of deploying this technology here? We've observed negotiations of weaker cipher suites when these proxies are in place. A big one is use of Diffie-Hellman key exchange for perfect forward secrecy. What perfect forward secrecy is, it's a cryptographic mechanism that prevents anyone from in the future decoding that traffic if they were to obtain the private key. So this is a risk of, an organization may perform collection. Let's say you had captured all the traffic to Google Mail for like 5 years, but you can't encrypt it. And maybe 5 years in the future, somehow you obtain the private key that was used with that communication. If the TLS cipher suite was negotiated using ephemeral Diffie-Hellman for perfect forward secrecy, they still would not be able to decrypt that traffic. Well, we found these products typically don't support that cipher suite. And so if I'm using Chrome and I'm talking to Google without a proxy in place, yeah, I'm getting all the benefits of perfect forward secrecy. As soon as I'm sitting behind a Cisco iron port, I'm negotiating a weaker cipher suite than I would have before. Another implication is that the proxy becomes a high-value target. If you're an attacker, this is a pretty valuable point on the network to have a compromise. This device is man-in-the-middling all the encrypted communication leaving the organization and is inspecting the clear text traffic. So it's pretty high-value target. Typically, these devices also contain signing keys that are trusted by all the endpoints within the enterprise. So that's another reason they're very high-value targets. There's potential legal issues here. In the United States, we have a law called HIPAA that restricts access to healthcare information. Well, do you really want to be intercepting and inspecting, the healthcare information of your users as they visit, the healthcare insurance website or they get the laboratory test results over SSL? Do you really want to be inspecting that and running afoul of HIPAA regulations? And then this other area is what we call transitive trust. If I'm behind this proxy, I never even see the server certificate that's on the endpoint. Essentially, I'm delegating all my trust to the proxy and hoping that proxy makes wise decisions around roots of trust, certificate validation, and other steps there. You're relying entirely on the validation logic in the proxy. So, let's say Google Chrome does a great job at validating certificates and even goes above and beyond in some cases. Well, if there are bugs in my web proxy that I've deployed on the border of my enterprise, I could be exposed to man-in-the-middle attacks upstream from the proxy and have no indication at all on the endpoint. So to sort of give an example of some of these implications in terms of an untrusted root. Here you have a client and they're visiting example.com. Example.com has a certificate issued by DigiNotar. And this was a certificate authority that was revoked. Trust was revoked in the certificate authority after a very serious breach last year. They're now out of business. So let's imagine that client, they had an updated browser, or they applied a Windows update or a new version of Chrome, and they no longer trust DigiNotar. So when they get this certificate, they don't trust DigiNotar, and it fails validation. They get a big fat browser warning, and they know something's wrong. Hey, that web server presented a certificate, and I don't trust it. But note also, though, that this endpoint does trust the corporate certificate authority. So now if we have a web proxy in place, and that example.com site is presenting a DigiNotar issued certificate, the interception proxy, let's say, imagine this has not revoked trust in DigiNotar. That product still trusts that root CA. It hasn't been updated. The trust in that root has not been revoked. So it happily validates that certificate. The proxy then issues a new certificate under its corporate certificate authority for example.com and presents that to the end client. The end client validates that happily, and whereas without the proxy in place, the client would have gotten a browser warning and known that something was wrong. With this proxy in place, they don't see any warning at all, and it's due to the fact that that proxy still trusts DigiNotar. What we had found is in Cisco IronPort, it took them quite a bit of time to revoke trust in this root CA. The way roots of trust are managed in the Cisco product is literally firmware updates. There's no interface to manage the roots of trust. If Cisco wanted to revoke trust in DigiNotar, they had to release a new version of the software, and every administrator in the world running an IronPort had to go apply that software. So long cycle to manage things like that, which you actually need to get ahead of and manage pretty rapidly. X509 validation can be transitive as well. So what does the proxy do when it's presented a self-signed certificate, expired certificate? We talked a little bit about a revoked CA, but what about a certificate that's been revoked? It's on a CRL list, or OCSP would have revealed it to have been revoked. Another issue we discovered was with basic constraints checking. What that is when you are issued a certificate, there's a flag in there that says this certificate is not a certificate authority. It should not be used to sign other certificates. It's a leaf node. Well, years ago, back in 2002, Moxie Marlinspike did a talk showing that Internet Explorer version 4, 5, and 6 at the time wasn't properly checking the basic constraints flag. So the impact was I could go purchase a certificate for example.com from Thought or VeriSign and use that certificate to issue a certificate for Google. And if you didn't actually check the flag and realize that, hey, wait a second, example.com certificate issued by VeriSign is not a CA and it's not authorized to sign other certificates, it would have shown perfectly valid and there would have been no warning presented to the user. And then null prefix injection. Pretty thankfully, we didn't run into this issue in any of these products. This is the issue where back in 2009, both Dan Kaminsky and Moxie talked about if you put a null byte in the common name of these certificates, many pieces of software were using C-string routines that were assuming null terminated strings to validate these strings and see, is this common name match where I'm visiting? Well, these are X509 strings. They're ASN.1 encoded, so the null byte is not a terminator. And some certificate authorities would allow you to actually register like google.com null byte example.com as a certificate with a common name. And that's since been fixed, but that was a pretty big flaw at the time. One issue we ran into is with key pair caching. So generating an RSA key pair is a very computationally expensive process. And so what these proxies do is they only want to generate that key pair for a given website one time. So the first time someone browses to Google Mail from behind the proxy, it'll generate an RSA key pair, sign a certificate, and cache that. What we found was that the caching was based on either host name or a combination of host name and IP address. So if down the road there was a man-in-the-middle attack upstream, you would never know that it happened because it would still be using the cache certificate, even though the upstream certificate has changed. To give you an example of how that would work in practice, the first time the user visits example.com, the proxy negotiates SSL with the endpoint. The proxy itself generates an RSA key pair, issues and signs that certificate using its corporate certificate authority that's on the box, and then presents that newly generated cert back to the client. So on a subsequent visit, if you can imagine, it doesn't actually generate a new key pair. It uses the cached key pair. And what if there was a man-in-the-middle attacker somewhere upstream from the proxy? So example.com presents a cert. The man-in-the-middle just presents some other cert for another domain. And what we found is there was a flaw in the caching logic in Cisco Ironport where it would always use the same cached key even if the upstream certificate had changed. The impact there is that you would never know that there was a man-in-the-middle attack going on upstream from you because you're continually presented that same certificate that was issued when you were first visited that website. That's since been fixed. So one of the issues is how do these proxies, how do these products handle different failure modes? If a certificate is invalid for any variety of reasons, what's the user experience? What does the proxy do? There's essentially three approaches to that problem. One is to fail closed, essentially, tear down the SSL connections and stop. Another option is a friendly error code, where a friendly error message is displayed to the end user telling them what went wrong. And a third is to allow that connection to pass through, which also has some issues there. Each has trade-offs. So fail closed, right? Terminate both the sessions immediately if that end certificate is not valid. Well, it's a pretty secure approach, but not very usable in that you just get this unable to connect error message in your browser, and the user just doesn't have an idea of what just went wrong. Some products have out-of-band agents that are deployed to the endpoint that can display a message and tell the user, hey, endpoint server had a expired certificate, and explain that to them. The friendly error message the client, excuse me, the proxy in the context of the website they're browsing would present an error message to the user telling them what went wrong and what the error is. One risk here is if there was, say, a CSRF vulnerability in one of these products. Not saying there is, but if there could be, you could basically, an attacker could cause that click-through just to go right through, and the user would never even see that message page. But it is more usable, a little less secure. And what we call pass-through is basically continue the session, and where possible, pass the same flaws along to the certificate that was issued by the CA, the proxy. So if it was expired, you know, the certificate on the endpoint was issued a year in the past, expired a year in the past, the proxy would issue a certificate that was expired a year in the past, and the user would see an error saying expired certificate. You really can't do that with self-sign, you know, so there's not a good way to let the end user get an error message from a self-signed certificate. So they're all trade-offs, and there's not clear that any one failure mode is correct when you're actually man-in-the-middling the SSL connections. So what we did is created a website that allows you to test for all these common issues. Essentially it does CSS includes from a variety of hosts over SSL, and each of these hosts has a certificate that's flawed in a very particular way. And it creates a table, and the table is colored in based on whether the browser loaded that CSS file or not. So it's a really simple, easy way to test for these flaws when you're sitting behind one of these proxies. It'll also test your browser if the browser had some of these flaws. It also includes the request headers at the bottom, and sometimes that'll indicate like the brand of proxy that you're traversing. If you see warnings when you run this test, if you accept the warning, essentially it may show up as vulnerable, but in fact the user was presented with a certificate error, and they would have been allowed to make a choice whether to continue to connect to that insecure website. So here's what that site looks like, ssltest.offenseindepth.com. Here is browsing from a client directly that doesn't have any of these flaws, and it shows the request headers at the bottom there. Here is browsing from a client that's sitting behind one of these proxies. In this case, this is the security posture of Cisco Ironport. It trusts unknown certificate authorities. It trusts self-signed certificates. It actually fails to validate basic constraints. So this is a pretty big issue where for users behind a Cisco Ironport, you can actually man-in-the-middle connections using certificates issued by a leaf node. And also it doesn't perform any sort of certificate revocation checking or OCSP checking at all. So here's some of the issues we found in the Cisco product. We've been working with them for over a year now on these issues. We got the clear to start disclosing some of these issues at Black Hat Europe. There's some Cisco bug IDs here that you can go look up. The self-signed certificate issue, the unknown CA roots issue. They did add a user interface element to the Ironport administrative console that allows you to force it to drop these connections. So that's a pretty effective mitigation to these flaws where, like I said before, you can cause it to fail closed in the case of these certificate flaws. Other issues we worked with Cisco to disclose is the lack of CRL or OCSP checking, failure to check basic constraints, and a flaw in the logic for how it was doing key pair caching. So Cisco has fixed these in future releases that haven't been released yet. The last we were told was in July, 2 major releases of Ironport software coming out that will address these issues. The findings we had were in version 7.1.3 of Ironport. Another kind of ugly design flaw is that there's no user interface for managing roots of trust. Cisco ships the roots of trust as part of the firmware image. You can't see what they are. You can't change what they are. If Cisco wants to revoke a root, they have to issue a new firmware image, and you have to apply that to your Ironport. We have been told that in a future major release, they will be introducing a user interface to allow you to manage those certs. So that's going to be a great improvement. We also looked at the Estero security gateway. They're now part of Sophos. They don't perform any CRL or OCSP checking either. When we went to talk to the Estero security team, they told us that they felt they didn't feel that was a security vulnerability, but rather it was a design decision, and that they felt that because CRL and OCSP has issues in practice, that it wasn't worth implementing that in their product. So I kind of think that, yeah, you probably ought to make a best effort at checking these certificates, but they felt that due to some issues in practice with these protocols that they didn't want to implement them in their product. This product has a friendly error mode, which is pretty useful, and then also it has a nice user interface for managing roots of trust, and they can update the roots of trust using like the antivirus definition update mechanism, so very rapidly. These are some positives in the Estero product. It also supports the ability to blacklisting of certificates. We looked at the Checkpoint security gateway. We also looked at the Microsoft Forefront TMG. Found no issues in either of those products, so they get a big Fonzie thumbs up from us. We didn't find any flaws in any of those products. They failed closed in all test scenarios, and they have both included support for managing roots of trust. So to real quickly, I'm a little bit over time, but go over the recommendations we have for organizations that are applying these products, that are deploying these products. Patch them regularly. You're never quite sure what they're fixing in that firmware revision. It might be something really important. Test your proxies before you decide which one to buy and which one to deploy. Consider the trade-offs between the security and the end-user experience. I think you owe it to your users to at least inform them that their traffic is being intercepted and inspected. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure in what jurisdictions you may have obligation or not to let them know, but I think it's probably good practice. Beware of roots of trust and how you manage them, and be ready to rapidly revoke roots of trust. Have a plan for when the next DigiNotar happens. Consider the failure modes and defend these proxies. They're high-value targets. They have signing keys that are trusted by your whole enterprise, and they also have access to the clear text communications. If you're developing one of these products, please allow the administrators to manage the roots of trust. It's an important piece of functionality that I think has been ignored by some of these products. Consider making the default settings secure, so secure by default. The administrator can always choose to change the configuration options to make it less secure, but there's a good principle in terms of secure default configurations, and that's one of the mantras I think in Microsoft's SDLC. Test these systems under different attack scenarios, so understand the attack surface of a proxy, and if you're implementing one, ensure that you're accounting for that in your threat modeling. Consider how you secure the private keys that are going to live on this box. A full-blown HSM might be overkill. It might add a lot of cost to the box, but it's something to consider. How are you securing the keys? That's all the material I have for you. I'm a little bit over time. I wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge Jeff Jarmock of the Counter Threat Unit out of Chicago. He performed this research and he created that tool that hopefully you're checking out. He couldn't be here today, so I'm the one with the Brazilian visa and was able to come and deliver this material to you. And I also wanted to bring Luis Eduardo up on stage and give him a token of appreciation from the Counter Threat Unit. I've known Luis for many years now, and I'm very honored to have been invited to speak at Silver Bullet and now at You Shot the Sheriff. So to thank you for building bridges in the security community and helping us organize, I've got a CTU challenge coin to present you today. You're in good company with one of these, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, man.
All right.